Welcome everyone to Mishnah in Depth, Sanhedrin and Makkot for our final week together. It's been a pleasure learning you, and let's have one more. Enjoy this one more time. Mishnah in Depth is part of the Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division and is sponsored in her memory by her family. And we have been joining Rabbi Matthew Nitzanim these past several Sundays to come together. This class is, we are assuming you are independently learning the mishnayot on your own, and for one last time, we're going to come together and talk about what's gone on this week. Matthew Nitzanim is taught at Midrashet Amudim and is a musmach of the chief rabbinate. And with that, I want to hand things over.
Fantastic. Akela, once again, thanks for leading us in. Welcome, everyone. If I could just get a quick thumbs up that you can hear me and see me okay. Fantastic. And here we are for, I guess we could call it shiur number 7. In a technical sense, it's shiur number 2 on Makkot. But as we've discussed, it's not circumstantial that we're studying these two masechtot together, and they really go hand in hand topically. So we're in shiur number 7 of our study of Sanhedrin Makkot. And it's really been a pleasure to have this time to learn. Looking forward to what we're going to explore today. So I'll get maybe even before I get the slides up, if anybody has particular thoughts, observations. Last week we were still finishing up Sanhedrin before introducing Makkot, and by next week the focus will be on Shavuot. And so this is really our week for looking at issues of Masechet Makkot. If anybody has thoughts, things that sort of stood out to them in the Mishnah, questions that are on their minds, it'd be awesome to hear before we. I got plenty prepared, but would love to hear from you if anybody has.
It seems to me there was a fascination with Eidim Zomimot. Zomimim. They went into such detail. Were there so many cases of it? It just seemed to me there was. If this happens, and how could you tell? And if there were two groups of them, and how do you? And if they were brothers, there was the amount of detail on these was unbelievable.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that, Debbie. It is pretty striking. Masechet Makkot, we have 3 prakim. So just as a brief overview, the second chapter, and today in principle we're focused on chapters 2 and 3 mostly, but chapter 2 is about the cities of refuge, right? So if someone kills accidentally, and they are sent off to a city of refuge, these arei miklat, and so the second chapter focuses mostly on that. The third chapter is mostly about malkut, about lashes, right? If you commit a crime that doesn't call for execution, you might be subject to this a lower form of punishment, namely lashes. And so a discussion of what it looks like when someone gets lashes, as well as the kinds of virot for which one would get lashes. But the first chapter is devoted almost in its entirety to this very niche case of Eidim Zomimim, framing witnesses, which is a particular case, just so we're on the same page, just to review, that the Eidim Zomimim is if, we're presuming that Eidim witnesses come in a kat. A kat means a grouping, right? Kat is related to the word kita, right, as a class in modern Hebrew. So a group of Eidim, a set of Eidim. So a set of Eidim comes and says, Ruvain, that's our go-to person, Ruvain committed a crime, and the second cut of Eidim says the first cut of Eidim, the first set of Eidim couldn't have testified that because they were with us in some other place at that time. That's a pretty rare thing, I presume, to have happened, and yet Chazal seem to be really worked up about it. Why do they care so much about Eidim Zomimim? Number one, I don't know. That's my number one rule as a teacher. First of all, I don't know. But having established that, what might we be able to offer? So, we already mentioned last week that the Mishnah is aware of the fact that there's some disagreement between the Chachamim, the sages, the rabbis, we might even call them the inheritors of the Pharisees, and the Tzdukim, the Sadducees. There are these different groups that are operating in the Second Temple period and so on. And there's some arguments about how to think about jurisprudence in the Torah, how literally or not to read various verses in the Torah. And so it seems like there's something in the background there about the rabbis asserting their authority about how to interpret the Torah, and the Eidim Zomimim being an important case in highlighting the importance of truth-telling Edim. It's going to a different point, which is actually tied to something we'll address later today, which is that, in the American civil court, as a general rule, right? If someone testifies, a ruling in court can, in principle, be in contradiction to what a witness said, right? You could hear a witness, they can say what they think, and you could conclude, I don't believe the witness. In the rabbinic system, if a witness has spoken, that is treated as truth. It is a boundary of truth. And therefore, no ruling in the court can be in contradiction to what the witness has said. In order for that to work, we need to have a huge amount of trust in our witnesses. Right? Instead of having a low threshold for who can be a witness, but also have low trust in our witnesses, there's a high threshold and then a high level of trust. So the concern about Eidim Zomim is also about the level of trust. It highlights the fact that the Chazal are very, very invested in having a high level of trust in Eidim. And so that probably is something what's happening there. I'll say one more point, which is the scholar Moshe Habertal came out with a book, I think 2 years ago, called Leidat HaSafek, the birth of doubt, where he tries to argue that the rabbis, particularly in the Mishnah, sometimes they're talking about real rules for real cases that actually came up. But a lot of times what they're doing in the Mishnah is actually kind of playing mind games, intentionally. That is what the genre of the Mishnah is. They're trying to imagine how we might think through complex cases. It's to highlight the sophistication of the Torah, and that we've thought through all these different thought puzzles that might arise. And Eidim Zomim might really be that, right? Eidim Zomim is this problem where I have these different witnesses who are saying different things. How do we choose whom to trust? And it might be that the fascination of Chazal is because it's such an interesting thought puzzle, and that's why they're invested in studying it. Those are a handful of thoughts, but certainly more to explore there. Thanks for bringing it. Yeah, Debbie.
Would that be why they also bring up androgynous and things like that? In other words, it's to take logic to its extreme. And what would it be? Because those cases aren't so common either.
This is Habertal's argument. Take a Masechet Kinim. For those of you who are doing Mishnah Yomit, in 10 months from now or something, in a while, you'll make your way, if you stick it out, to Masechet Kinim, which is in Seder Zvachim. Right? Zvachim is all about the various sacrifices. Kinim is about bird sacrifices. And Kinim, I think Robert Alman said, the best training one could get in calculus is studying Masechet Kinim. It's just these cases of what you had a bird and then the bird flew away and then a different bird came back. Is it the same bird? Is it a different bird? What if you had 3 birds but then 2 birds came back? It's all thought puzzles. And Halbertal argues that nobody thought that you're going to have to do calculus to figure out how to bring a sacrifice. But instead, what the rabbis are doing very intentionally is showcasing these thought puzzles. It's meant to say something about the wisdom of the rabbis. It's meant to say something about the sophistication of Torah. It's meant to say something about the role of Torah study, not only being about reaching hard conclusions, but that there's some sort of ritual, religious meaning to the study of Torah itself, even for addressing cases that don't really come up. There's something like that happening in the background.
Like in Yibum. Like in
Yibum. Yeah, Masechet Yevamot, for those who followed along. Yeah, that was crazy, right? All these wild cases. Now, the Mishnah is also real. It is also a work of law, and is meant to be taken seriously in terms of its legal conclusions, and yet it's not exactly a work of law in the traditional sense, or maybe not in the conventional sense. There's something more going on there, and there might be these literary pieces that are happening as well. So thank you for bringing that to us. Okay. I think with that, I'll bring up the slides, and there are a handful of things I'd like to discuss in looking back at these 2 prakim, Masechet Makkot. So just a moment, if you'll bear with me.
Thank you, that was fascinating.
Oh, absolutely. What a pleasure. Here we are, Drisha 7, and I'll share that screen. If I could, as usual, just get that thumbs up if you can see my screen. Let me see the slides on the screen. Amazing. So let me put that in slideshow. Now you should see it in full screen. Yeah? Amazing. Thanks, everybody. And here we go. 3 things I want to discuss. Yeah, you picked up on it. I like the number 3. 3 topics I want to address for our closing shiur. One is the Sfat Emet on cities of refuge. Yehuda Aryeh Alter Migur, a key figure in the world of Chassidut, I'll say more about him in a moment. I want to talk about clemency, this notion of giving pardons. Right? Does someone with authority have the power to let people off the hook from their punishments? An issue which I think arises from the Mishnah if we look carefully for it, and which still has some present meaning wherever you find yourself, but certainly if you're in the U.S. In the past few weeks. And tattoos. Tattoos show up in the third parak as an example of the kind of thing for which one can get lashes, and just maybe it's an opportunity to discuss some of the halachic discussion around tattoos. So here we go. The Sfat Emet. The Sfat Emet, again, Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Leib Alter Migur. He is an influential figure in the development of Chassidut. His writing, his drashot are named Sfat Emet, and since then he has been known as Sfat Emet. It's not a title nor a name that he used in his lifetime. His children gave his work, and hence him, the name Sfat Emet, after he died, because the very last drasha that he gave, Parashat Vayechi and Tafresh Samechei, closed with a pasuk, I believe from Mishnah, that uses that term Sfat Emet, and so they adopted that as the title. But regardless, he is to this day, the Sfat Emet is one of the foundational works in the development of Chassidut, not from the very first generation, but a little bit later on. And interestingly, the Sfat Emet has, as Hasidic writing goes, is one of the more popular works of Chassidut to read among non-Hasidim, among Misnagdim. I suppose primarily because he is not entirely unique, but somewhat unique in having written not only his Hasidic discourses on the Parsha, on the Torah, on the holidays and so on, but also wrote a commentary on the Talmud, on the Gemara, which at face value has no Hasidic language or ideas in it. There are scholars who say if you look really closely you can find some, but mostly not. So because he was already familiar from his Talmudic writing, so his Hasidic writing made his way into non-Hasidic circles as well. So among non-Hasidim, he's fairly well known. Why are we talking about the Sfat Emet? Because his yortzeit is tonight. Tonight, the 5th of Shvat, marks, I believe, 120 years since his passing, and so it's a fitting time to study some of his Torah. And he actually has some really wonderful teachings about the Ir Miklat, about the cities of refuge. And so I want to take this moment to look at 2 teachings from the Sfat Emet about the cities of refuge. Our starting point is the material we saw in the Mishnah, but we'll explore further in terms of the theological and spiritual teachings that the Sfat Emet has to offer us. Okay, so each of these teachings, in a sense, takes its starting point from the Mishnah, but it starts with the Mishnah, and then he comments on lines from the Gemara that comment on our mishnayot. So we'll have to work through it together. So first of all, just to get us started, the Arei Miklat show up more than once in the Torah. The primary place where this notion of the cities of refuge, again, these cities that were designated for unintentional killers to flee to, so that they can be safe from the Goel Adam, from the blood redeemer, from the relative of the person who was killed, who in principle has the authority to go back and kill the killer, unless they're in the Ir Miklat. So the primary locus in the Torah where the Ir Miklat are discussed is in Parshat Mas'eh, right at the end of Sefer Bimidbar. And yet, in Parshat Va'etchanan, right near the beginning of Sefer Devarim, we are told this moment, right, just as Moshe he's finished his opening, the first chapter, so to speak, of his closing speech to the Jewish people. He's about to start the second very long chapter of reviewing the Torah with them, and just before there's this little story that says, Az yavdil Moshe shalosh arim, that Moshe sets aside, he designates the Arei Miklat for Reuven, Gad, and Menashe, the 3 tribes, or 2.5 tribes that choose to settle on the eastern side of the Jordan River. And the Torah tells us where they are. At Betzer Bamidbar, this is this verse on the top of the screen. At Betzer Bamidbar, Beretz HaMishra LaReuveni, Betzer Amot BaGilad LaGadi, Betz Golan BaBashan LaManashi. So each of these tribes has one Ir Miklat. The first of which is given to Reuven, the tribe of Reuven, and it's a city called Betzer. Betzer is a funny term because It might be etymologically related to a mivtsar, which is a fortress. And yet Betzer is in the Midbar. It's out in the wilderness, in the desert. And that's the city that's designated for the tribe of Reuven. Okay. Comes the Gemara, Masech Makkot, right, commenting on our mishnayot that we studied this week. And there's a teaching. Here's the second passage on the screen. Amar Rabbi Tanchum bar Chanilai. Mipnei ma zachar Reuven limanot behatzalat tchila. Rabbi Tanchum asked, why was it that Reuven, the tribe of Reuven, had the merit of being the first to be counted towards saving? Namely, why is Reuven the tribe why is Reuven the first tribe to get an Ir Miklat, a city of refuge? Right here, the Moshe appoints cities, and he first appoints one for Reuven. And so Rabbi Tanchum mipnei shehu patach behatzalat tchila. Because Reuven himself, i.e. the person Reuven, the character Reuven, the son of Yaakov, was took that first step towards attempting to save. Shene'emar, vayishma Reuven, vayatzileo miyadam. It says in the Torah, in Sefer Bereshit, and Reuven heard and saved him from their hands. Who are we talking about? Who gets saved?
Yosef.
Yosef, thank you. Yeah, Yosef is saved, sort of. Right, the brothers seemingly want to kill their brother Joseph, who has this fancy coat and these fancy dreams. And Reuben hears about what's happening. He goes and he saves him. And so he ends up trying to get them to put Yosef in the pit, but then they take Yosef out of the pit and sell him off to the seemingly Yishmaelim, makes his way down to Egypt. And by the time Reuven gets back, Yosef is gone. So Reuven makes the first attempt at saving a person in danger. Right? We don't really have another story like that earlier on in the Torah of someone trying to save someone else from danger. And because Reuven attempted to save someone from danger, so he, in the merit of that, is given the first Ir Miklat. Okay, it's creative, right? There's something about Reuven saving, being first. And there's some sort of relationship, says the Gemara, between Reuven, the person who saves, and the Ir Miklat. Now, the Sfat Emet is going to take Reuven's story and his relation to Ir Miklat and pull it just a little bit further by referencing another verse in the story of Reuven and Yosef. Now we're entering into the world of Chassidut. We're at the passage on the bottom, where this is a teaching from Tafresh Samach Daled, near the end of the Sfat Emet's life. It reads as follows: Bapasuk hayeled einenu, va'ani ana aniva. So in the story, Reuven hears that his brothers want to kill Yosef. He saves Yosef and has Yosef put into the pit. He seemingly walks off. The brothers then take Yosef out of the pit and sell him, and then Reuven shows up, looks for Yosef in the pit where he thought he was safe, and discovers Yosef is gone. And he says, here, this is the language of the Torah, Hayeled einenu, the boy is gone, va'ani, ana aniva, where shall I go? Now it's a very odd thing to say, right? I understand the claim, oh no, the boy is gone. Why this question, and now where shall I go? What does that question mean? The Sfat Emet writes as follows: we are taught that Reuven was the first one. He opened up in this act of teshuvah, right, in attempting to save Yosef. And similarly, as we know from another Gemara, Hosea is a descendant of Reuven, Hosea the prophet, and Hosea is seemingly the first of the prophets, and certainly the first to ask the Jewish people to repent. And says the Sfat Emet, Kizot Shuva Shlema, this is ultimate repentance. Okay, now we're going to get, what is the formula for ultimate Shuva, ultimate repentance? She'ino motzelo shum makom u'metziut ba'olam al-yedei hachet. To realize that in light of what you've done, you have no place in the world. Okay, so the Sfat Emet wants to say that Teshuvah entails coming to the recognition that we don't really have any place in the world. To have some sense of being lost. That sense that you, in light of having made a mistake, having done something wrong, realize that you've kind of lost your footing, and that you're sort of not sure what to do or where to go, and that in language that he spells out in other teachings of his, that you have no choice, there's nowhere to turn but to God, that is teshuvah. And he continues and says, "V'nir'eh remez lezeh betzer bamidbar." He says this. There's a hint to this in that language, betzer bamidbar. Remember, Reuven's city is called Betzer. Betzer, which means a fortress, and it's in the midbar, in the wilderness. Perusho, meaning, imhum be'inav kemidbar ve'ein lo metziut, az betzer uklita yeshlo. He says, what does it mean that there's a betzer, a mivtzar, a fortress, in the midbar, in the wilderness? You need to become the wilderness, right? If you see yourself as wilderness, as lacking in place, lacking in being settled, that for you has the capacity to be a fortress, a klita, a miklat, a safe haven for you. Vehi bechinat Reuven. This is the way of Reuven. So what the Sfaramet wants to do is he's borrowing from this language of Betzer Bamidbar, the fortress in the wilderness, borrowing from his teaching about the relationship between Reuven and the Miklat, and wants to say that, to say the words, Ani ana aniva, where should I go? Which, the Sfaramet realizes, is not only the words that Reuven, the character, says in this moment of realizing that he has accidentally led to the either death or at least the losing of Yosef, where he says, in that moment he says, oh no, where do I go? And he says that kind of is the story of the Ir Miklat, the cities of refuge. This spiritual moment where you say, where do I go? I have no place to be in the world, and you have to flee. Flee to this place that God has set out for you. That, he wants to say that what that reflects is actually something spiritually very deep. That the real act of teshuvah, internally, of repentance, is to look at myself and say, I've lost my sense of where I am. I'm not really sure where to go from here. That, thanks to Reuven, thanks to Ir Miklat, is the act of teshuvah. I'm going to pause here. If there are thoughts on this one. Yeah, Saul.
I don't find it convincing.
Tell me why.
Vani ana ani ba.
Yeah.
He's talking about going back to Yaakov. He's the oldest son. Yosef disappears. He's terrified that he's going to be blamed. Now, I think that you can make a connection to Ir Miklat, but it's not about tshuva. It's about hiding. So he didn't kill Yosef. He wasn't part of that plan. And he wasn't even part of the plan to sell him. That was Yehuda's great idea. So he needs a place to hide out, to give his father time to quiet down. So you can make an argument. But to see Reuven as doing tshuva is a stretch that seems unconvincing to me.
Okay, so I'll say two things. One is, I could make it work, right? The Gemara has this language that suggests, right, that Reuven patach b'tshuva tchila, right? That terminology that shows in the Sfaramet, he's borrowing from the Gemara, that Reuven does some sort of tshuva. Now, it doesn't need to be that the statement, where do I go, is the thing that he did that constitutes repentance. That's the Sfaramet's claim. But there's some presumption with Chazal that Reuven does some sort of tshuva. So it's not out of left field that he wants to read tshuva into the story. But I want to agree with you that it's not abundantly obvious that that moment where he says, where shall I go, that functions as tshuva. I think we have to, in reading Hasidic interpretation of the Torah, we have to take as our starting point that the Hasidic teachers, by and large, I'll say, maybe entirely, but we'll say by and large, didn't see it as their goal to interpret, to figure out what the text of the Torah means at face value. Right there, I don't think this Sfaramet would be bothered by your suggestion, like, well, really just asking because he needs to figure out where to go. I think the Sfaramet and other Hasidic teachers would say, I'm starting with the presumption that there are actually all sorts of layers of spiritual meaning that can be drawn out from the verses. In particular, what often happens in Hasidic teaching is that there's one verse that's sort of taken out of its own context and just playing around with that verse rather than reading the story, the narrative as a whole. So I guess I would say it's kind of apples and oranges, meaning in terms of interpretation of the story, you may all be right. But the Sfat Emet, I think, is trying to get at this spiritual point and is using Reuven as his sort of framing for doing that. Yeah, totally. In a somewhat similar vein, I want to look at one more about this idea of how we think about the Ir Miklat in Hasidic terminology. So here we have this passage from the Gemara, which is based on what we saw in the Mishnah. Right, the Mishnah taught us that there need to be signs indicating how to get to the Ir Miklat. Right, I want to make sure that people know how to get there. And so it says that this is borrowing from the Mishnah, and this is the language that appears in the Gemara. Miklat haya katuv al parashat drachim. The word miklat, like refuge, was written on signs on Parshat Drachim at the intersections, so that the killer will know how to get to where they need to go. Amar Rav Kahana Ma'ikra. What is the pasuk from which we know this? Tachin lecha haderech, aseh lecha hachana laderech. Like the Torah says to make clear the way to the Ir Miklat, to the cities of refuge, and so you have to make it clear how to get there. As in the Gemara understands that, Rav Kahana understands that what that means to prepare the way is to have signs, to have good signage indicating how one would get there. Okay, put up signs at the crossroads so the Rotzeach, the killer, will know how to get to the Ir Miklat. Now comes the Sfat Emet. Oh, I'm sorry. Oops. Here we go. Comes the Sfat Emet, and he's going to read it a little differently. He writes as follows: Le'olam bechol makom nimtza derech haTorah. Wherever we go, we can find the way of the Torah. Rak shemitzparesh me'et hachaim anafim lekan ulechan. Yet from the tree of life, which is the Torah, there are branches, which he's imagining as sort of pathways, that go in every direction. Va'akol ma'Torah. But they all come from the Torah. Right? The Torah is the tree of life. Its branches move out in different directions, as do the pathways on the earth, but they all stem from the Torah. Lachen nikra Parshat Drachim. That is why it is called Parshat Drachim. Parshat Drachim is a term in rabbinic language that simply means the crossroads, the intersections. But I think that the Sfat Emet is reading it as the parasha, right? Some sort of like reading the parsha, meaning there's the teaching of the ways of the drachim. As it says in Tehillim, Tov Yachshar Hashem, good and righteous is the Lord. Al Kein Yorech Hata'im Badarech. Therefore, because God is good, God points the sinners on the way that they need to go. So he says, the Sfat Emet, Lachin ba'Ir Miklat haya katuv miklat miklat. That's why on the way to the Ir Miklat, on the pathway to the cities of refuge, there were signs that indicate this way to the Ir Miklat. Ukmo chen haTorah. Similarly with the Torah itself, Amru Chazal shekoletet. It says in the Gemara that just as the Ir Miklat, the city of refuge, provides safe haven, so too the Torah itself provides safe haven. The Torah is koletet. The reference there is that verse that we saw just a moment ago. I'm going back. Oops. At Beter Bamidbar on the top of the screen, where Moshe singles out the Ir Miklat. The following verse in the Torah is V'zot HaTorah asher sam Moshe lifnei bnei Yisrael. This is the Torah. This is the teaching. And then introduces the review of the Ten Commandments, and so that juxtaposition of the designation of the cities of refuge, immediately followed by the declaration, this is the Torah. From here, Chazal learn that just as the cities of refuge provide safe haven, the Torah itself provides safe haven. And now, Sfat Emet is going to argue for why. On the second to last line, V'hainu shele'ulam haTorah mora derech, ech la'ativ mikanu lehaba, afilu im kvar yatsa miderech hashava. Because the Torah is always guiding us along the way how to be our best from here on out, even if we have diverged, even if we have detoured from the main highway, from the derech hashava. So here's what the Sfat Emet wants to do, if we can try to repackage it. The Sfat Emet points out that we have this notion that just as the Ir Miklat, the city of refuge, is a safe haven. The Torah is a safe haven. The question is, in what way is the Torah a safe haven? So he wants to compare that just as there are pathways that lead towards the Ir Miklat, so too there are these pathways through the Torah. That it's possible that we've detoured away from what our life was meant to be, and nonetheless, there's a parshat drachim, there's a teaching for which way do we go next to get to our next safe haven so that we can move forwards. And so just as there would be these signs that direct us on what is the new path I have to take, how am I going to move forwards after having something gone wrong, like committing a crime? So the Torah does the same thing for us. The Torah is also a morad derech, right? In modern Hebrew, that'd be a tour guide. But the Torah is a guide for us for what to do when we've landed in the wrong place. We need a pathway forwards, and the Torah sets up pathways for us to take to where we need to go. I think these two teachings together are really touching in that both of them, the Sfat Emet is taken by this idea of space, right? Using these spatial metaphors for how we might think about spiritual growth, right? In the first teaching, what we're imagining is that tshuva is to realize I have no place. And in the second teaching, the Torah guides me towards my next destination. And being able to sort of introduce this sort of spatial language into our spiritual world offers us new ideas and new teachings. Chassidut, in general, the Sfat Emet in particular, is a matter of taste. So if this is your cup of tea, fantastic. There's really a great deal to study within the teaching of the Sfat Emet. I think particularly around these spatial metaphors, I think there's more to work with there. I may have written about it in the past, but there's a lot to work with here. And if not, we can move on to some more traditional study of Mishnah with our next topic, namely the death of the high priest. So let's explore for just a moment this funny thing that we saw in the Mishnah, right? What someone commits an act of killing by accident, unintentional killing. They run off to the city of refuge, and then they wait there. They just sit. They're safe until what happens?
The high priest dies.
Fantastic. The high priest, the Kohen Gadol, dies. And when the Kohen Gadol dies, everybody leaves the city of refuge and goes home. Why? Anybody have any good ideas for what the deal is with why it should matter that the high priest dies and so everybody gets to go home? Andrew, yeah.
I mean, the way it was always taught to me is that it's his job as one of the spiritual leaders of the community to be davening that such a thing does not happen in his lifetime. That the idea that someone would accidentally, again, like in an accidental way, kill someone else, cause someone else to die, not totally in their control. So that's clearly, some level of hashgacha pratis, some level of Hashem dealing with doing things. And so it's his responsibility to be asking for forgiveness for everyone. So it doesn't happen. And this is sort of a failure on his part.
So fantastic. So this is an idea that appears in the Midrash and was best popularized by Rashi. Right, the Kohen Gadol should have been davening for everyone. He didn't do that, so it happened on his watch as his fault. The funny thing about that answer is, so why does everyone go free when he dies? Meaning, sure, let's say that it's kind of his fault that unintentional murders happened. How does that lead us to the conclusion that when he dies, you're free to leave the city of refuge? Like there's something a little ambiguous about the through line there. Yeah, Debbie.
I once remember learning that there will be a lot of mourning when he dies, and possibly that would enable people to sympathize with the sadness that was caused by this inadvertent killing. So there would be less anger and it would be supplanted by empathy.
Amazing. If I'm not mistaken, this idea is introduced by the Sforno, Italian commentator on the Torah. I believe he's the first one in rabbinic writing to suggest it. Maybe Maimonides in the guide maybe says something along these lines. I don't remember, but certainly the Sforno argues this, right? That it's this moment where this major figure, who presumably is not too controversial of a figure, because Kohen Gadol just does avodah in the Beit HaMikdash, right? As opposed to the king, or some other like leader that might be more controversial. But here's someone who died, and it's a big deal, and everyone's kind of sad, feeling empathy and mourning, and so hopefully the Goel Hadam, the person who in theory has license to kill the Rotzeach, is also kind of not in that headspace at that point, and so it's a good time to start sending everybody home. Entirely possible. I just stumbled upon, as I was preparing the shiur, a suggestion in academic circles that it's just an estimation that the killer is supposed to stay in the Ir Miklat, in the city of refuge, in theory, for the amount of time that the person killed would have stayed alive. Like, you should lose that amount of your life. However, we don't have a great way to assess what that amount of time is. It could vary from one person to the next. There's no way of knowing for sure. And so we just default to one person the duration of whose life you need to spend in the Ir Miklat. And the person that we use is this person who's a central role in Jewish life, is the Kohen Gadol, and connected with Kapara and Atonement. So we use the Kohen Gadol as this sort of like average metric. Like, stay until that person dies. Okay, interesting, thoughtful. I don't know if there's enough evidence to really back it up, but it's an interesting idea. But really, the interesting idea that I want to raise here is another suggestion. Also, I don't think it appears in traditional writing, but appears in some academic writing. I learned it from a teacher of mine, Professor Baruch Schwartz, who suggests that maybe in order to understand this notion of the release of those who are held in the city's refuge at the time of the death of Kohen Gadol, we could really understand best in light of a pasuk that we just read in Parshat HaShavua. The Jews are in Egypt. They've been enslaved. They're suffering. And suddenly, just before Moshe has his revelation at the bush, at the not burning bush, it says as follows. The second pasuk on the screen. Vayhi vayamim harabim ahem. Vayamot melech Mitzrayim. Vaye'anchu v'nei Yisrael min ha'avodah vayiz'aku. V'tal shavatam al ha'elohim min ha'avodah. So after many, many days, the king of Egypt dies, and suddenly the Jews start moaning and wailing, and God hears them. And it's at that point it says, Vayizkor Elokim et brito, that God remembers the covenant and remembers the people, and goes to Moshe and says it's time to take them out of Egypt. There's this important turning point in the story when the king of Egypt dies. Why does it matter that the king of Egypt dies? So already Rashi and some of the Farshim
it was the impetus for them. They thought that maybe things would improve and change, and when it didn't, then that was the impetus for them to cry, which was the impetus for God to hear and see and do. And then
exactly right. So Rashi and Farshim are already mindful of exactly that. Thank you, Debbie. That they kind of thought something might change. Excuse me. Once the king had died, but nothing changed, and so they cry out. And so the suggestion would be that in the ancient world, it was not uncommon that at the time of the death of the king, those who were held prisoners would be released. Why were these prisoners at the time of the death of the king? Seemingly it's because we're talking about a position that is inherited by the son of the king. And so at the time of the death of the king comes the incoming of the new king, who wants to earn the favor of the public. And to earn the favor of the public, they start releasing people who have been held imprisoned. And so that's this expectation that the Egyptians have. That the Jews have in Egypt, and it doesn't come through. It's based on this reality in the ancient Near East. And so the suggestion would be that this is what's happening with the Kohen Gadol. There's this idea in the ancient Near East that at the time when a major leader dies, and in theory the new leader comes in, that's a time of release of those who are held imprisoned, because it's a way of earning public favor. What's maybe ironic or even very thoughtful is that this does not happen in the Torah at the death of the king. It happens at the time of the death of the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, who doesn't really have political power. Right? Instead, someone who's supposed to be Gadol Me'achav, who's supposed to be well respected by the people. And yet it's it's important that they earn favor with the public. And yet the Kohen Gadol is also separated from the political order in a way that keeps this notion of the releasing of those who are stuck away from those with political control. And so already in the Torah, this idea of people go free when the new king comes in, here we have it as people go free when the new Kohen Gadol comes in, and that already is a little bit posing a question about the fairness, the argument would go, the fairness of a new king letting people go in order to, as a political move, as a political stunt. Instead, we have built into our system that this happens at the time of the handover to the next Kohen Gadol. This might reflect an idea that we already saw further developed in our study of Masechet Sanhedrin. In this paper by Ian Spare on clemency in the Halacha, he writes as follows. In this way, Jewish criminal law operates with a kind of inverted clemency. Mercy and compassion are front-loaded in the criminal process, and on the back end is the Beit Din's extraordinary power to impose punishment. Compare that to the two secular modern systems of criminal law. In his particular case, he was writing at Georgetown. His focus was on the American civil system. Conviction and punishment are comparatively easy on the front end, but on the back end is the executive's extraordinary power to impose mercy. So what he's calling our attention to is that, right, there are all sorts of systems. This is present in the American system today, as well as other places like Israel and so on that are based on the English civil law, which give the executive, i.e. the president, the power of clemency, which is rooted in a much older concept called the royal prerogative of mercy, which is still held today by either the crown or representatives of the crown, where the royals, the monarch, or the closest thing to a monarch, like the president, has the authority to just take people who have been sentenced to some punishment and let them off the hook. That is the power of clemency, or the power of pardon. And the argument goes, right, I thought about bringing up a passage, but the writing is so clunky. But in the Federalist Papers, there's discussion of the power of pardon. And there, right, the argument is made that it's the idea of clemency, the idea of pardon, is that the law can sometimes be a little bit too stiff and stern, and we need some space for being compassionate. We build it in by giving the executive the authority to, when they want to, just let people off the hook. Historically, though, the roots of the power of clemency, of pardon, are probably related to this idea that we mentioned before about Melech Mitzrayim, that the idea is that it is a demonstration of the power of the king, and also a political stunt on the part of the king, to earn favor by somewhat arbitrarily letting people off the hook from the punishments that they've been given. Right, the court will say that someone is guilty and comes to the king, and I'll be the savior. I'll let you off. I'll use my overriding power to let you off the hook. And what's striking is that already in the Torah, we have this power of clemency, to the degree to which it exists, is sort of given not to the Kohen Gadol, but it's framed through the life of the Kohen Gadol, right? It all happens automatically through the death of the Kohen Gadol, not the king. And then we saw in Masechet Sanhedrin how much more so that the Chazal take these great efforts to build into the system what we'll call mercy and compassion. We try to find all these ways to avoid reaching the conclusion that someone needs to be sentenced to some punishment, say execution. But once that's happened, once they've been sentenced, that's it. There's no going back, right? There's no override on the system of pardon or clemency. What we do have is lots of protections earlier on in the system to avoid reaching the conclusion that someone is meant to be sentenced to punishment. It's an interesting reflection on what our tradition of the Torah offers us, especially at this particular political historical moment, where there's for a long time in the U.S. there's been debate about the fairness of the power of pardon, the reasonableness of the power of pardon. Certainly at this particular moment, there's a lot of debate around that. And it's worth thinking about where does the idea of the pardon power come from, and what other ways of thinking about the relationship between a firm justice and making some space for some compassion, what are other ways that we might imagine that in the judicial system? Saul, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I've always been troubled by the Ore Miklat. I understand that the objective is to stop the Goel Adam, stop vigilante justice, move it away from individual retribution and vengeance. But then you need a process, because once you set this up and somebody through some action kills somebody, they'll say it was by accident. And their relative will say, no, you've had an argument with them, you did it on purpose. So you need a process. It's not enough to stop vigilante justice. So it seems to me the Torah is at the first stage, and it would be interesting to know if the Ore Miklat ever worked, and if there was a due process that followed.
Sure. So I guess 2 points on that. One is that Chazal are under the presumption, this is spelled out more clearly in the Gemara than is in the Mishnah, and it might even be the right way to read the Psukim, that if someone commits an act of killing, they immediately flee to the Ir Miklat, and the Beit Din is in the Ir Miklat, right? Remember way back when we started Sanhedrin, we tried to get, how do we get the number 23 for the number of judges we need for a Beit Din that handles capital cases? The number 23 is because of this language regarding the Arei Miklat, where it says Vishaftu ha'ida, Vitzilu ha'ida, that the community, the Eidah, judges and or saves the person. And we say an Eidah is 10 plus 10, that's 20, but then we win by 2, so 22, but it needs to be odd, 23. That language, those psukim, Vishaftu ha'ida, Vitzilu ha'ida, we're talking about the Ir Miklat. And it seems to be the Chazal under the presumption, and maybe will be the clear implication of the psukim, is that where the Beit Din meets is in the Ir Miklat. Meaning you run to the Ir Miklat, and that's like a safe base until you've stood before the Beit Din, but then you still have to go to the Beit Din, where the Beit Din will assess, are you guilty, are you not, was this intentional or unintentional? And then if it was unintentional, you can stay put, and if it was intentional, they'll send you for execution. So it seems that's sort of built into the system. In terms of the due process element. I don't believe that we have any historical accounts of the Arei Miklat functioning other than, the Torah itself. And again, rabbinic language, which doesn't talk about them existing, only talks about them in the abstract. I don't think we have any historical evidence of the Arei Miklat. Again, that doesn't mean they didn't exist, they didn't work, but we don't have any, to the best of my knowledge, no record of what really happened there. So that remains something of a mystery. All right, with the time that we have left, I just want to talk a little about tattoos. It's this funny area of halacha. When I was studying Kola, I remember discussing with the Rosh Kola, who said that he recently gotten a shaila about someone who wants to get a tattoo, and he said the tricky thing is, it's not like Hilchos Shabbos or the laws of kosher, where there's so much that's been written. When it comes to the laws of tattoos, not that many people have written all that much about the laws of tattoos. And so it's kind of hard to know, like, what are the technicalities of the laws of tattoos? The default is just don't do it. And yet, there might be more to discuss if we look at the halacha material. We're not going to look at everything that's to be seen, but first, I would just want to look at this Mishnah, which is really striking. If for those of us, maybe like me, who walk on the presumption, tattoos forbidden. Again, we have this Mishnah. Oh, I didn't list where it's from, but it's from the 3rd chapter. We should have seen it this week. Hakotev k'tovet ka'aka. Right? If you make a tattoo, that is one of the forms of forbidden behavior for which one can get lashes. The Mishnah goes on to say, "Katav v'lo ki'aka, ka'aka v'lo katav, ino chava ad sheyichtov v'ka'aka b'dio." So you need to do both a writing part and a tattooing part. The idea is that you both have to apply the ink and also do the cutting so that the ink can get into the skin. But the second line is what's so striking. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda mishum Rabbi Shimon Omer. A guy named Rabbi Shimon says in the name of another guy named Rabbi Shimon, Eino chayav ad sheichtov shem Hashem, shneimar, uchtov et kaka lo titnu bachem, ani Hashem. Says Rabbi Shimon, you are not liable for punishment until you tattoo upon yourself the name of God, which he derives from the language of the pasuk. He says, "Don't put a tattoo. I am God." So the presumption is, what you can't tattoo is the name of God. Okay, just at face value, according to Rabbi Shimon, what kind of tattoo can you put on yourself? Kind of anything.
Anything else.
Right, anything but God's name. Because the argument is that the problem with tattoos is putting God's name on you. But anything else, you're fine. Kind of wild. I remember I was in high school and I heard a story about someone who was like at a 7-Eleven and saw some guy with a tattoo, like with God's name, Yud Hey Vav Hey, like tattooed on his bicep. I guess people are doing that, but most people got tattoos don't. And so that would really be like a huge heter in terms of tattoos. Now, first of all, the Gemara argues, the Gemara already rereads this line from Rabbi Shimon and says, the problem is not putting God's name, the problem is to put the names of other deities. Meaning it's not an interpretation of the Mishnah, it's a suggestion of an edit of the Mishnah, that the real problem is not having God's name, but having some other deity. So don't tattoo, I don't know, Zeus onto your arm. Okay, still leaves a lot of space open for a lot of tattoos. It's a good excuse me, it's a good question why this would be the case. The Rambam in Lord suggests, in the Yad HaChazakah suggests that the idea of the prohibition on tattoos is related to some ancient pagan practice where people would want to demonstrate that they are owned by, they're the servants or slaves of their deity. And the same way that slaves would be marked with tattoos, so two people would mark themselves with the name of their deity to show that they are the slave, the servant, the property of their god. If that's the case, we would derive that the only problem is tattooing the name of your god. But just sticking a flower on there or a motorcycle shouldn't really be a problem. It doesn't fit into the tam ha'isur, the reason for the prohibition. There is some suggestion that maybe the Rif, Rav Yitzchak Alfasi, paskins this way, that he actually rules halachically in accordance with Rabbi Shimon. However, the vast majority of the Rishonim, the Rambam, the Ritva, and this is how it's brought down the Shulchan Aruch, all rule against Rabbi Shimon, and that we do not follow that opinion, and actually any tattoo is a problem. So if you're so desperate to get a tattoo, you want to make it like a little bit better, I suppose, don't put the name of either your god or any other gods, and that's better, but still, we don't follow the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. That said, there is an interesting machloket about tattoos in terms of actual halachic practice, which emerges from an ambiguity in the language of Rambam, and it's not only in Rambam. I just want to bring this to highlight the point, but the Ra'avad and the Rivan, a number of the Rishonim point in different directions on this, and there's some halachic debate, even to this day amongst poskim. The Rambam in two different places has two different implications about what exactly the prohibition is. The language he uses in the Mishnah Torah, right, that on the bottom part of our slide, that first citation, the language he uses in the Mishnah Torah is katav v'lo rasham b'tzeva, o sharsham b'tzeva v'lo katav b'sita patur ad sheyichtov v'ka'akea, shenamar yichtov v'ka'akea. So the Rambam focuses on the term katav, to write, and says that if there is writing without color or color without writing, it is not a problem until you have done ad sheyichtov v'ka'akea. There needs to be ktiva, writing that happens. Because the language of the Torah is ktovet ka'aka. So the Achronim suggest that the implication of Rambam here in the Mishnah Torah is that the prohibition on tattoos only applies to ktiva, namely what would have to do the act of writing. What would we need?
Letters.
Letters, yeah, we need letters, words. There are some of the Achronim who take this view, debate whether we follow the rules of Hilchot Shabbat. In Hilchot Shabbat, in order to transgress the prohibition midoraita of writing on Shabbat, to write a minimum of 2 letters. Okay, so for tattoos, it does have to be 2 letters, or is it sufficient only have 1 letter? Okay, but there have to be letters. Meaning, in this line of thought, again, which one might find in the language of Rambam here, and this other Rishonim implied as well. If you get a tattoo of, I have a friend who just a couple weeks ago got here in Tel Aviv, got a tattoo of a pomegranate. It might be that if we follow this line of thought, as appears in some of the Rishonim and is implied by the Mishnah Torah, it's not a problem because there was no text. Now the problem is that there are other Rishonim who suggest otherwise, and it might even be implied by Rambam himself in the Sefer Mitzvot. The Sefer Mitzvot, the language he uses is, this is now that bottom line, he's hiranu mereshom begufeinu b'minei tziv'onim. There's a prohibition on mirshom to mark on our bodies with any sort of coloring. And so there's some ambiguity, right? What happens here, right? The Achronim is they try to go through the Rishonim and figure out how do they formulate the prohibition. Again, most of the Rishonim just weren't getting tattoos. But can we look here at their language and figure out, do they think that the prohibition is on all dye on skin, any sort of tattoos? Or is there something specifically about text, about getting words on yourself, which again might tie us back to this idea that the problem with tattoos is about marking yourself in some sort of pagan way, associating yourself with some sort of deity or cult or clan, and that absent any letters, that can't be what you're doing. And so there's some space to consider whether maybe the D'Oraita prohibition is really only on text, and that if you got, say, a pomegranate tattooed on yourself, wouldn't exactly be a problem. Now, most of the poskim say, if we read carefully, we can see that what we're discussing here is what you'd have to do to get punished with the punishment of lashes to do the Isur D'Oraita, the biblical prohibition. Most of the poskim will still come out and say that even if you want to say that only God's name or only text gets into the Isur D'Oraita, there's still an Isur D'Rabbanan. There's still some sort of rabbinic prohibition on any tattoos. So there's not really anyone out there, reputable rabbinic source, at least that I could find, that says actually some tattoos are fine. I haven't found that. But still, there's more complexity to the story, the halachic story of tattoos, than I think we generally presume. We tend to presume that tattoos, evil, bad, you're out. And the truth is, there really is some halachic discussion, not a lot. Seemingly not that many Jews have been in the habit of getting tattoos, with the notable exception of the Beit Israel community, which actually has historically had some traditions around tattooing, particularly for women, on the face, with no text. So a question, to what degree do we count that as halachic evidence and halachic discourse? But the short is, most Jews have just not been in the habit of getting tattoos, and yet there really is some room for halachic discourse and debate around the parameters of the rules on tattoos. Final thoughts, questions on tattoos? If you're asked any recommendations for designs. All right. So if that's the case, then we're kind of here at the end. It has been an unbelievable pleasure to study with everyone here. Everybody's been with us for this whole journey of studying Sanhedrin and Makkot. I really want to take this moment in the final 30 seconds I have to strongly encourage you to continue, certainly in the Mishnah Yomit learning cycle. It's really a wonderful way to engage in some really meaningful learning. Masechet Shvuot has some really important discussions around language, how to think thoughtfully about the words that we use. For those of you, if you enjoyed Masechet Nedarim, you like Masechet Shvuot. If you didn't like Masechet Nedarim, try Masechet Shvuot anyway. A good friend, Shalhevet Schwartz, is going to be teaching. I've spoken with her. She has some really unbelievable material lined up, so you definitely don't want to miss out. And thank you all for being with us for this wonderful learning.
And I also want to let people know that if you are still catching up or reviewing Sanhedrin, or want to review it in the future, or recommend to people who are behind on Mishnah Yomit, the first 3 recordings of this class are up on Drisha's audio library and our YouTube channel. If you go to youtube.com and look for us, we are Drisha Institute, or if you go to library.drisha.org, you can find the recordings that are up, and more, and hopefully the rest of the class will be up within the following week. And what's this
Amazing.
link?
As we're closing up, it's really been a pleasure to learn with you all. For more opportunities to engage in Torah together, I write Torah once a week. You can follow me at littleblessings.substack.com. That link is in the chat. Feel free to join in on that. A very different but exciting Torah learning adventure. Love to continue to be in conversation on Torah with everyone who's here.
Happy learning, and be well.